The thread was still on her wrist when I found her. White thread. Silk, probably, the kind you'd use for a good dress, and somebody had looped it around her left wrist 3 times and knotted it tight enough to leave the skin pink underneath. She was sitting in the snow against the wheel of a broken wagon, not crying, not calling out, just sitting there with her hands in her lap like she was waiting for a stage that was already 4 hours late. I rode past her the first time. Didn't mean to. I was coming down off the ridge above the Powder River with 2 hides on the pack horse and my mind on camp, and the snow was coming sideways and I didn't see her until she was already behind me. Took me 50 yards to pull up. Took me another 30 seconds sitting there before I turned back around. That's the truth of it, I almost didn't. My name is Gray Horse Walking. That's what the Lakota called me, I'll come to why. My mother called me James. My father called me Boy mostly, which tells you something about my father. I was 38 years old that winter and I had been living rough in the Powder River country for going on 9 years, trading hides, running horses sometimes, doing work for the Oglala bands when they'd have me. I had a small cabin that I'd built myself and a good ROA in horse, and about $40 in gold coin buried under the floor. That was my life. It fit me like an old coat, not soft, exactly, but shaped to my particular angles. I turned back. She didn't move when I rode up. Just watched me from under the brim of a wool hat that had been pulled down so hard over her ears it had flattened them. Brown eyes, steady, not afraid of me, which was either courage or exhaustion, and I couldn't tell which yet. I said, "You alone out here?" She said, "I was with 4 others until this morning." "Where'd they go?" "Ahead," she said. "They left me." I looked at the wagon. The left rear wheel had come off the axle, not broken, just off, the linchpin probably kicked loose by a rock, and it was sitting in the snow 3 feet behind where it ought to be. Half a day's work to fix it, less if you had the right tools, which I did. But they'd left her. Middle of January, temperature somewhere around 15 degrees, and they'd left a woman beside a busted wagon in the Powder River country and ridden ahead. How long ago? Before noon. It was past 3. She'd been sitting there better than 3 hours. I got down off my horse and didn't say anything else for a while. I found the wheel and I found the linchpin in the snow about 6 feet away, and I got the wagon jacked up and the wheel back on. She watched me the whole time, not helping and not getting in the way either, which was exactly right. When I was done, I packed the tools and turned around, and she was standing now, the thread still looped on her wrist, her right hand holding it like she'd been thinking about pulling it off but hadn't decided yet. I said, "Where were you headed?" Long pause. "East," she said. Something in the way she said it, not like a destination, like a direction somebody else had pointed her in. "Where do you want to go?" I said. She looked at me for a long time. The snow was coming sideways still, and the light was going, and it was cold enough that I could see her breath coming quick and shallow. She was wearing a coat that wasn't near heavy enough for this country in January and boots that were leather-soled city boots, not made for snow. "I don't know yet," she said finally, and then quieter, "somewhere that isn't east." I didn't take her to my camp that first night. I took her to the Oglala winter camp on the creek below the ridge, running Elks Band, people I'd wintered with before, because it was closer and warmer, and because I didn't have enough food at my cabin for a second person. The Lakota have a word, Wakintignaka, which means something close to generosity of the heart, and running Elks people had it in quantity. A woman named Hollow Bone, who was maybe 60 years old and built like a good post, put her in a lodge and got a fire going and fed her without asking her a single thing about where she'd come from or what she was. I sat outside in the cold for a while. Running Elk came and sat with me. He was maybe 50, a quiet man with a long face and gray in his braids and hands that looked like they'd done about as much work as hands can do. We smoked and didn't say much. After a while he said in Lakota, the thread on her wrist. I said yes. He said wedding thread, plains traders use it, means she's spoken for. Against her will. He thought about that for a while. I don't know her will, he said. Do you? I didn't. Her name was Clara Sandoval. Her father had been a Spanish rancher out of Texas. Her mother a woman from the Ohio country whose name I never learned. She'd grown up on the ranch, which her father had built and her brothers were supposed to inherit, and when her father died the brothers hadn't wanted her. She had a sharp tongue and strong opinions, and they were the kind of men who didn't like either in a woman, and so they'd arranged a marriage east. A man in Omaha they owed a debt to. The dress was already made, the thread already sewn into the hem as a mark of ownership, which was a custom I'd never heard of before and hoped never to hear of again. She'd been put in a wagon with 4 men hired to deliver her, and she'd ridden 3 weeks north and west before the wheel came off. She told me this in pieces over the next 4 days, because I stayed at Running Elk's camp instead of going back to my cabin, and I'm still not entirely sure why. Partly the weather, partly because I'd brought her here and it seemed wrong to leave her with people whose language she didn't speak, partly because there was something about her that made me want to stay in the same place she was, which was a feeling I hadn't had in a long time and didn't quite know what to do with. She wasn't soft, Clara. That's the first thing I'd say if somebody asked me to describe her. She wasn't soft and she wasn't easy and she wasn't looking to be rescued, at least not the way most people look to be rescued, which is with a kind of expectation in them, like they've already decided you owe them something. Clara didn't have that. She was grateful to Running Elk's people in a clean, uncomplicated way, and she worked hard in the camp from the second day on, helping with the hides and the cooking and carrying water, even though her hands weren't made for it. She didn't speak Lakota, but she figured out what needed doing and she did it, and nobody had to tell her twice. She still had the thread on her wrist on the 3rd day. Hollow Bone noticed. She came to me and said something in Lakota and nodded toward Clara, and I said I'd take care of it, and then I spent most of the afternoon thinking about whether I had any right to. The thread was a mark of property. Taking it off would mean something to Clara, maybe to the men who'd put it on her, definitely to me. It wasn't nothing, was the thing. It was a declaration, and I was a man who lived alone in a cabin on the Powder River and traded hides and didn't have much business making declarations about other people's situations. That evening Running Elk called me to his lodge. Just me, not Clara. He sat across the fire from me and he had his pipe and he set it between us but he didn't light it yet. He looked at me for a while in that way. He had not unkind, but not giving anything away either. He said, "You found her." I said yes. He said, "Why did you turn back?" I told him I didn't know. He looked at the pipe. "I think you do," he said. On the 4th morning, I woke up before dawn and I went out, and I cut the thread off her wrist with my knife. I didn't ask her first. That bothers me now that I didn't ask. I should have. But she was asleep and I was standing over her with my knife and the thread, and I just cut it and set the pieces in the fire and watched them burn. The silk made a small blue flame and then it was gone. She woke up while I was watching the fire. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she looked at her wrist, at the pink marks still on her skin, and she pulled her sleeve down over them. She said, "You shouldn't have done that without asking." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." Pause. "Are you going to tell me why you did it?" I didn't have a good answer for that. The honest answer was something like because I couldn't stand looking at it anymore or because it made me feel a kind of rage I didn't know what to do with. But those weren't things a man says to a woman he barely knows, so I said, "Because it wasn't right. Whatever they told you it meant, it wasn't right." She looked at the fire for a long time. "My brothers will come looking," she said, "or they'll send those 4 men back. They paid good money for that arrangement." "I know. And the man in Omaha, he'll want to know what happened to me." I said, "I expect so." "So you've made yourself a problem," she said. "I've made myself a problem," I agreed. She looked at me then, really looked, for the first time in a way that wasn't just measuring whether I was safe to be around. I felt it. I don't know how to describe it better than that. I felt it the way you feel when the sun comes out from behind a cloud and the warmth hits the side of your face. She said, "Why?" And I didn't answer, because I still didn't have an answer that was fit to say out loud. Running Elk burned the thread pieces himself that afternoon. Not the same fire. He built a separate small fire outside his lodge, and he put the ashes from our fire in it, and he said something over it that I didn't fully understand, something about releasing what was bound and what had no right to be bound. And then he waited until the second fire burned down to nothing, and he scattered those ashes on the snow. He said to me afterward, "Now it's done." I said she might not see it that way. "Does she want to go east?" "No." "Then it's done," he said again. That evening Clara and I sat outside the lodge and watched the light go off the hills to the west, that particular orange-pink that you only get in January in this country, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's made of something valuable. I had my hands around a tin cup of coffee, and she had her knees pulled up to her chest, and she was looking at her left wrist again, at the marks that were still there, fading now but still there. She said, "Tell me about this place." So I did. I talked for a long time about the Powder River country, about the way it was in summer and the way it was in winter, about the elk herds and the buffalo that were getting fewer every year and what that meant for Running Elk's people, about the high plains and the way the sky came down at the edges. I'm not a man who talks much. Never have been. But something about sitting there in that particular light with that particular woman made the words come easily, and I didn't try to stop them. After a while she said, "And you've been here 9 years. Going on 9. Alone." I thought about how to answer that. "Mostly," I said. "What brought you here in the first place?" "A horse," I said, which made her laugh, and her laugh was a good sound, not polished or practiced, just genuine, a little surprised, like she didn't use it often enough. "I was running horses up from Texas and I got this far and I didn't want to go any farther, so I stopped." Just like that. Just like that. She was quiet for a while. Then, "I've never been anywhere I wanted to stop." The 4 men came back on the 8th day. I'd been expecting them. Clara had too. She'd stopped flinching at sounds the first few days and started just watching the tree line instead, which is a different kind of readiness. Running Elk's people had seen them coming an hour before they got there, 2 scouts up on the North Ridge, and so we were all of us prepared when they rode into camp. 4 men, and they'd added a 5th on the trail somewhere, a bigger man on a gray horse who rode in front and had a manner about him that said he was used to getting what he came for. He looked at me, and he looked at Running Elk, and he looked at Clara, and he addressed himself to me, which was a mistake. He said, "The woman is under contract and she comes with us." I said, "She doesn't want to go." He said, "That's not a consideration." Running Elk said something in Lakota that I didn't translate right away. What he said was, "Tell him this is Oglala land, and these men are not welcome to make their business here." I told him. The big man on the gray horse looked at the camp, 20 lodges, maybe 60 people, and none of them looking particularly friendly, and I watched him do the arithmetic. He looked at me again. "You cut the thread," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I did," I said. "That's destruction of property." "She's not property," I said. He said something then that I won't repeat. Something about what I was doing out here and what my connection to these people meant, and what kind of man lives among Indians. That kind of thing. I've heard it before, and I'm not going to give it space here. I stood there and let him say it, and when he was done I said, "You can go back the way you came." He said, "I don't think I will." What happened next happened fast. Running Elk moved first, not toward the men, just toward his own lodge, and 2 of his young men appeared on his left with rifles that they held easy, not raised but not out of reach. 3 more of Running Elk's people materialized from around the lodges on the right. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was a fact, a simple presentation of what was real. The big man on the gray horse looked at all of it. He looked at Clara, who was standing slightly behind me and to my left, and her face was very still, the way a face gets when somebody has made a decision they've been making for a long time and they've finally made it. He said, "This isn't over." I said, "Yes, it is." They turned around. It took them a while. Men like that need to take their time leaving, need to feel like they're leaving on their own terms, but they turned around and they rode back the way they'd come. Running Elk scouts followed them to the edge of Oglala country and then came back and said they'd kept riding and hadn't turned around. That night there was a fire and food, and Running Elk said something over the meal that I did understand. Midakui oyas adjective I ing. All my relations. A thanks and a binding both. Clara sat beside me at the fire. At some point in the evening, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just naturally the way things happen when they happen right, she put her hand over mine where it was resting on my knee. She didn't squeeze it or make anything of it, just put her hand there. I left mine where it was. Running Elk called me Gray Horse Walking because of a roan horse I'd traded him once that turned out to have a peculiar gait, a smooth 4-beat walk that the Lakota called Gray Horse Walking, though the horse was actually brown-red. He kept the name on me after the horse was gone, said it was because I moved through things the same way, not fast, not showy, but covering ground. I thought about that a lot that winter, about what it meant to cover ground. Whether I'd actually been going anywhere or just moving. Clara stayed at Running Elk's camp through February. She talked to Hollow Bone for hours every day, learning words, learning to do things with her hands that she hadn't done before. She was good with the hides, had a patience for the scraping that not everybody has, a willingness to sit with one thing for a long time until it was right. Hollow Bone took a liking to her in the plain, uncomplicated way that old women sometimes do, which isn't sentimental but is real. I went back and forth between my cabin and the camp. I had traps to run and the season wasn't over, and I needed the hides for my own reasons. But I came back to camp more than I strictly needed to, and I spent more evenings at that fire than I would have otherwise. And Clara and I talked the way people talk when they're both figuring out the same thing at the same time without saying so directly. She told me about Texas, about her father's ranch, the adobe house and the cottonwood trees along the creek and the smell of the mesquite burning in the evening. She'd loved that place. It was the first home she'd had, and she'd lost it the way people lose things, not all at once, through disaster, but slowly, through the decisions of people who had more power and less sense. She asked me about Before the Powder River. I didn't usually talk about Before the Powder River, but with Clara it came out in pieces over several nights. Missouri, the war, what the war did, the years after the war that I don't like to look at directly. She listened without flinching, which was something. The way some people listen makes you sorry you said anything. Clara listened like it was just the truth and the truth was okay. She said once, "You stopped here because it was far enough away." I said, "Far enough from what?" She said, "From whoever you used to be." I thought about that for a few days. The honest answer was yes, that was part of it. But sitting there in Running Elk's camp with Clara next to me at the fire, I wasn't sure anymore that the distance was the point. In March, I got a letter. This is unusual enough out here that it's worth noting. The mail doesn't exactly run to the Powder River country. But there's a trading post 2 days ride south that gets a post rider through maybe once a month. And I stopped there for supplies in late February, and there was a letter for me, forwarded from somewhere that had forwarded it from somewhere else, and it had been traveling for 3 months. The letter was from a man named Cole Tillman. I knew that name. Cole Tillman was a cattle broker out of Kansas City, a man of some wealth and some ambition, and he'd been buying up range rights in the Montana Territory for the better part of 2 years. The letter asked if I would come see him. It didn't say why, it didn't need to. I'd heard about the drives he was planning, big Texas cattle drives pushing north in the spring, and somebody needed to know this country. I knew this country. I brought the letter back to camp and I read it again, and then I sat with it for a few days without saying anything to Clara, which was stupid. When I finally told her, she looked at me with that steady brown-eyed look she had and said, "How long have you been sitting on that?" "Few days," I said. "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know. That was true, and it was also slightly dishonest. I knew what the letter meant in terms of money, real money, more than $40 under a cabin floor. I knew what it might mean in terms of a different kind of future than the one I was currently heading toward, which was more seasons of trapping and fewer furs to trap. What I didn't know was what Clara had to do with any of it, or what right I had to factor her into a decision that was mine. She said, "Tell me what you're thinking, not the careful version, the real version." I said, "The real version is that I want to take this job, and I don't want to leave." She was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't actually in conflict," she said. "I know that," I said. "I just don't know what you want." Long pause, the fire between us, the sound of the camp settling down for the night. "I want," she said slowly, "to not go east. I told you that the first night." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. "I'm telling you that the answer to what you mean includes not going east, and not going back to Texas, and not going anywhere that isn't wherever you happen to be going." I looked at her. She looked back. She said, "Is that plain enough?" I said it was. I wrote back to Cole Tillman. I told him I'd come down to meet him in Cheyenne in April, and I told him I'd bring someone who knew the northern passes as well as I did, which was Clara, because she'd been listening to me talk about them for 2 months and she retained everything. Tillman wrote back and said fine, bring whoever I wanted. He was interested in information from any reliable source. We rode south in early April, just the two of us, down through the breaks above the Powder and out onto the high plains where the grass was just starting to come back green after the winter. 3 days riding. Good days, cold mornings, warm afternoons, the kind of weather that makes you understand why people came west in the first place. Clara rode like she'd been born to it. I found this out on the first day when I'd been quietly worried about her pace and then realized she was matching me without any effort. Her father's ranch, I forgot. She'd grown up horseback. She said on the second evening, setting up camp, "Tell me about Tillman." I told her what I knew. She asked good questions. She had a business mind that she'd had no use for before, but it was there, sharp and organized, and she asked about the routes and the water and the forage and the likely problems with a drive of that size through that country. And by the time we made Cheyenne, she knew as much as I did and had already thought of 3 things I hadn't. Tillman was a big man, well-dressed, the kind of man who'd been successful long enough that he'd started to mistake confidence for intelligence. He shook my hand and looked at Clara, and I could see him working out who she was and deciding she was decorative. 2 hours later, he'd stopped looking at her that way. She'd corrected him twice on geography, once on water rights law as it applied to the Northern Territory, and once on the likely timeline of a spring drive given the snowpack I'd described. She wasn't sharp about it. She just said what was true in the same tone she said everything, which was matter of fact and unhurried, and Tillman was a smart enough man to hear it. He offered me the job, scout and guide for the first drive, with a share of the trailing fee. The number he named was more than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. He looked at Clara. "Can she come?" I said, "She goes where she wants to go." He looked at her. "Do you want to come?" She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought, not performing consideration. Then she said, "What's the pay?" Tillman blinked. Then he laughed, genuine laugh. He named a number. She said half again that. They shook on it at something in between. We got married in Cheyenne, in a room above a saloon, with a preacher who'd had a drink or two but said the words clearly enough. There was no thread, no dress. Even she wore the clothes she'd ridden south in, clean and mended, and I wore what I had. Running Elk had given me a small piece of carved bone when we'd left, a horse, and I'd kept it in my coat pocket, and I had it in my hand during the ceremony without knowing I was going to. Afterward she looked at my hand and saw the bone horse, and she said, "What's that?" I told her what Running Elk had said when he gave it to me. In Lakota, which I translated as, "May you move like gray horse walking, no hurry, all the ground you need." She turned it over in her fingers. She gave it back. "That's a good thing to be told," she said. I should say what the job was exactly, what we were riding into, because it wasn't simple and it wasn't easy, and there were weeks of it that I don't look back on with any pleasure. Tillman's Drive came north out of Texas in June, 2,000 head of longhorns and 23 cowboys, and a chuck wagon that broke down so many times I started thinking of it as its own problem rather than a solution to one. Clara and I rode ahead, scouting water and pasture and the crossing places, and then came back to the drive with the information. It's not glamorous work. It's long days in the saddle and cold nights on the ground, and arguments about routes with men who know better than you, and then the satisfaction of being right. She was right more than I expected. She had a quality I've seen in maybe a handful of people in my life. She could hold a map in her head and rotate it and see where things were relative to other things, and she never confused two creeks or two passes or two ridgelines. Once she'd seen a stretch of country, she had it. It made her indispensable in ways that Tillman hadn't anticipated, and that I won't say I hadn't. There were 2 bad weeks in July. The drive hit rough country above the Platte, broken ground and no water for 3 days, and the cattle started dropping, and there was a disagreement among the cowboys about whether to push through or turn east. Clara and I both said push through. The water was 2 days ahead, and the eastern route was longer and drier. The foreman said turn east. He was a man named Briggs who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive, and he didn't like being disagreed with by anybody, let alone by me, and let alone by Clara. We pushed through. Clara had found a spring the week before, marked it in her memory, and on the second waterless day she rode directly to it. A narrow seep in a rock face that barely deserved the name but was enough, just enough, to keep the herd together until the river crossing. Briggs didn't apologize. Men like that don't. But he started deferring to Clara's route suggestions after that without comment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The drive made the Montana Territory in August. Tillman had his range rights and his cattle and his money, and he paid us out on the spot, full amount, with a handshake and a look at me that was as close to respect as a man like that gets. He said, "You looking for more work next season?" Clara said, "Depends on the terms." We went back north. There was no dramatic reason for it. The Powder River country was home, had been mine for 9 years, and had become hers in the space of a winter. We bought 2 horses at a trading post and headed north in September, before the weather turned, with enough money put by to build something real. I mean a house, not a cabin, a house, with rooms and a proper floor and a fireplace that drew right. I'd spent 9 years in a cabin that leaked at the corners and had a fireplace that smoked in any wind from the northwest, and I was done with that. Clara had requirements too. She wanted a room with good light for the winter months, and a proper kitchen, and she said she'd like a porch facing east for the mornings, which was the first thing she'd told me she wanted in terms of a home, and I wrote it down mentally and did not forget it. We built the house in October and November, with help from 2 men I'd traded with before and from Running Elk's people, who came down from the winter camp for 2 weeks and worked alongside us and then went back north. The day Hollow Bone left, she took Clara's face in both hands and said something I couldn't hear. Clara came back from that with her eyes bright, and her jaw set the way it got when she was holding something in, and she didn't tell me what Hollow Bone had said until that evening. She said, I have a good man and I should tell him so plainly, because men don't always know. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, so, you have plain then, I'm telling you so. I said, I hear you. Do you believe it? That was the harder question. I thought about it honestly. About the years before the Powder River, and the man I'd been in those years, and the particular kind of hollowness that gets into you when you've been nobody's person and nobody's been yours for long enough. About finding a woman alone in the snow with thread on her wrist, and turning back when I almost hadn't. About fires and carved bone horses and 2,000 longhorns crossing bad country on Clara's memory of a seep in a rock face. I'm getting there, I said. She said, good. She came and sat beside me, not ceremonially, just sat, the way she did everything, plainly and without fuss, and she put her head against my shoulder. The house smelled of fresh-cut pine, and the fire was going, and outside the first real snowfall of the season was coming down quiet and straight. I sat with my wife in our house, and I didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. Everything that needed saying had already been said or would be said later, and right then it was enough just to be in the same place as someone who had chosen to be there. Running Elk died in the spring of the following year. Sick, the way the old get sick in a hard winter, slow, then fast. I found out when one of his young men rode down to tell me, and I went up alone and sat with the family and stayed for the burial, which was in the Lakota way, up on a scaffold in the cottonwoods along the creek. Clara came too. She stood with Hollow Bone and held the old woman's hand, and nobody said anything that needed saying out loud. Afterward I sat with Hollow Bone for a while. She had a fire going outside her lodge and we sat beside it, and she said things about running elk and I said things about running elk, and it was the right kind of grief, not drowning, just real. The kind that doesn't go away but learns to fit around the shape of your life without breaking it. Hollow Bone said to me, near the end, something that I've thought about many times since. She said, he liked you because you turned back. I said, turn back for what? She said, he didn't say. Just that a man who turns back when he doesn't have to is a particular kind of man. He thought it was worth knowing one. I rode back south that evening. The grass was coming in green along the creek bottoms and the sky was the particular blue you only get in this country in spring, a blue so clean it almost hurts to look at. Clara was on the porch, the east porch, the morning porch, though it was evening, and she was watching me come down the hill. She didn't wave or call out, just watched. When I got closer I could see she'd been reading, a book open in her lap, and she'd folded the corner of the page, which was a habit I'd told her I found irritating and she'd maintained anyway because she thought bookmarks were pretentious, which was the kind of argument we had. I got down off the horse and I tied it and I went up onto the porch and I sat in the other chair. She said, how was it? Hard, I said. She put her hand on my arm, left hand. The marks on her wrist were long gone. I'd looked for them once, about a year after we were married, and I couldn't find where they'd been. The skin was just skin. You hungry? She said. In a while, I said. So we sat. The evening coming down off the hills, the light going that particular way it goes in this country, and my wife's hand on my arm and the sound of the creek somewhere below us and the horses in the pasture. My horses. My pasture, my house with the east porch and the kitchen and the fireplace that drew right. I was 50 years old by then. It had taken me that long to end up somewhere I recognized as mine. I'll tell you something about that. About what it's like to have a life that fits you. Not a life handed to you. Not a life inherited or borrowed or arranged by somebody else's accounting of what you owed them. But a life you built with your own hands out of what was available, which in my case was 9 years of rough country and one woman alone in the snow, and a piece of burned silk and a carved bone horse in my coat pocket. It fits different than you'd think. There's no great ceremony to it. You just wake up one morning and you're in the right place with the right person and the work is real and the ground under your feet is yours and you think, oh, this is what it was supposed to feel like, and you're glad you turned back. Clara said to me once, in the second year, that she'd been thinking about that first night in Running Elk's camp. The fire and hollow bone and the language she didn't speak and the thread still on her wrist. She said, I wasn't sure about you then. I said, I know. She said, I decided in the morning, when I woke up and the thread was gone and the ashes were in the fire. I didn't like that you did it without asking. I know, I said again. But I thought, this is a man who burns things that shouldn't exist. That's a particular quality. She paused. I decided I wanted to know more about it. I thought about that. That's a lot to read into a thing, I said. Maybe, she said, but I wasn't wrong. She wasn't. I keep the bone horse on the windowsill now. The east window, Clara's window. In the mornings the light comes through it and hits the carved horse and throws a small shadow on the sill, and I look at it sometimes when I'm sitting at the table drinking coffee before the day starts. Running Elk gave it to me and said what he said. No hurry, all the ground you need. I've thought about those words a long time, about what it means to take the ground you need without hurrying after it, about the 9 years I spent going nowhere in particular, and how that turned out to be exactly where I needed to be, about the woman sleeping in the other room, who chose to be there as freely as anyone has ever chosen anything, which is the only way it means what I needed it to mean. The fire's down to coals, the horses are quiet in the pasture. The first light is just starting on the eastern hills, the sky going from black to deep blue to something that hasn't got a name yet, but will be gold in another half hour. I'll put more wood on the fire. I'll start the coffee. I'll stand at the window for a little while and watch the light come, and when Clara gets up she'll find me there, not because I waited for her, but because the window faces east and that's where the light is, and she knows that about me. And I know she'll come and stand beside me when she does. That's all, that's the whole thing. That's everything.